So, a missing piece of the puzzle, young people's accounts of violence and abuse towards parents. So, as I said, I'm Dr. Vicky Baker. I am a lecturer in gender-based violence at Manchester Metropolitan University, and I'm based in the School of Nursing and Public Health. This piece of research, my PhD research, was actually funded by the Connect Centre, and that's at UCLan at the University of Central Lancashire. So although I'm based at Man Met now, this was where my PhD was funded originally. So I'm going to start by giving you an overview of the issue of child and adolescent to parent violence and abuse, and I'm going to be calling that CAPVA for short. So I'm going to give you a brief overview. Some of you may know a lot about this issue already. Some of you may be new coming to it for the first time. Going to give you a brief overview before then talking to you a bit about the methodology of my PhD, not too much detail, but a little bit of an overview. And then we're going to dive in to the qualitative aspect of the PhD. So this has involved interviews with young people. So a lot of the session today is going to be you hearing their personal accounts of using violence and abuse towards parents and what it looked like, what they think they did it, this sort of thing. And then we're going to have some activities built in as well for you to reflect upon, your own practice in relation to what this research says. So, firstly, what is child and adolescent to parent violence and abuse, CAPVA for short? Just to say off the bat that I'm calling it CAPVA. In the PhD, I called it APVA, so adolescent to parent violence and abuse, and that's because the emphasis was really on adolescence and that period of child development. However, it comes under many different names, originally called battered parent syndrome, also child to parent violence. That was one of the earlier kind of names for terms for this issue, but it's called a whole range of things, and there isn't one set term and there isn't one set definition, and importantly there isn't a UK specific definition. So the one I've given you today is the one myself and a colleague, Helen Bonnick, came up with a couple of years ago in a literature review that we did for the Domestic Abuse Commissioner. So our definition is that CAPVA can be defined as a pattern of harmful and in some cases controlling behaviour by children or adolescents towards parents or any other caregivers where abusive behaviour can be physical, verbal, emotional, psychological, financial, property-based, or in some rare cases sexual. Abusive behaviour can represent intentionally harmful and controlling dynamic, and that has similarities to that emotional terrorism of intimate partner abuse, or it can be unintentionally harmful, and this means it's representing more kind of functional or expressive forms of aggression, and this could be used to communicate distress, anxiety, or trauma. And a lot of the findings of my PhD was kind of helped us to create this definition, but it was also built very much upon a number of other previous definitions as well. But I thought it might just be useful just to have that right at the beginning. So what are some of the other characteristics? Well, it's characterized, as with any form of abuse, by secrecy and shame, but specifically with CAPVA, it has that element of shame around poor parenting, around the fact that typically society sees that parent and child power dynamic as being that hierarchy with the parent at the top and the child doing what the parent tells them. And so this inversion of that typical parent-child sort of hierarchy sort of contributes towards these feelings of shame, and it also kind of contributes to why it's not really been investigated so much as other forms of abuse. So this kind of inversion of that typical power structure, that also is the case in terms of our understanding historically of what victims and victimizers look like. So typically we think victims have less power, victimizers or abusers have more power. And this is at odds with how we view the parent-child relationship. So these kind of inversions of power structures really contribute to that stigma. So definitions to date, They've been useful, particularly useful in emphasizing power as being central, but importantly that CAPVA is around patterns of behavior. It's not really one-off outbursts of violence, although in some severe cases, those one-off outbursts could be used to control parents' future behaviours. So it's important to be reflecting on patterns, also intention, but importantly the harms that those behaviours cause, so how it's perceived and felt by parents and carers. So emphasising power, pattern, intention and harm help us to move towards this more contextualized understanding where we can appreciate that parents' fear of future behavior from their children acts as a kind of mechanism of control. And that's really important when we're working with parents, because sometimes it might seem like parents aren't implementing boundaries, they're not reinforcing, they're not keeping consistent with what they're saying to their children, and this can be frustrating for practitioners. But it's really important to remember that within this dynamic, the fear of children's behavior is really driving that, and really reinforcing that kind of that avoidance of implementing boundaries. So it's important for us to understand that kind of context of fear to really appreciate parents trying to make changes and how big that is for them within this dynamic. So those are just some of the few sort of characteristics that I wanted to highlight before we get going. So also maybe just to say as well, we'll probably keep the questions to the activity points in this session. So there'll be lots of opportunities for you to ask questions as we go along. So it's an under-researched issue. So unlike child and intimate partner abuse, CAPVA or child to parent abuse hasn't really been recognised as a sort of significant social problem until relatively recently. Could you everyone turn off their microphones, please? Thank you. So yeah, so there's not this recognition so much as there has been for child and intimate partner abuse. And this is probably because of what I alluded to earlier, in that the parent-child power dynamic that involves these normative power structures, and child to parent abuse really challenges that. And it's very uncomfortable for society to think, well, children might be violent to their parents. So that's kind of been hypothesized as being one of the reasons why it's not necessarily been investigated so much to date. And for this reason, the research is still in its earlier stages. But encouragingly, over the past sort of 15 to 20 years, there has been much more research in this area, and it is sort of ever growing exponentially. So that's really positive to see. So my particular PhD research was addressing a gap in that although parents and practitioners definitely had their voices within the research context. Could everyone turn their microphones off? Thank you. So yeah, parents and practitioners' accounts, their experiences and perspectives dominated the research, and they still do dominate. I did this PhD research, I started it sort of 8 years, it was 8 years in the making. And at the beginning this was the case, and this is still the case now, that young people's voices just aren't really heard within this space. And I think that's probably for a number of reasons. One of them being that it's quite sometimes difficult to gain access to young people, not only just gain access to them, but gain access to young people who actually want to speak about their use of violence and abuse. So yeah, accounts are dominated by parents and practitioners. And obviously it is important for parents and practitioners to have a voice, because parents are essentially the victims of this form of abuse. So that's essential that their voices are heard. And practitioners are the ones trying to support families to help address this issue. So understanding their framing, how they see the issue, and what they see as some of the, the barriers and the challenges to addressing it is really vital to us developing practice that's really appropriate. However, on the other hand, it is problematic not having young people's voice, because how parents and practitioners construct child to parent abuse, the use of violence and abuse towards parents, might be quite different to, parents and practitioners might be quite different to young people's constructions. So we might actually not really have the full picture. And that means when we're designing interventions and supports, it's not necessarily bearing in mind the young person's perspective. And we need to make sure to address any sort of issue that we're kind of meeting young people where they are, what they're at the point that their understanding is with their use of violence and abuse at home. So typically, previous research has involved clinical samples, and that's slightly problematic because we don't, it gives you insight into the more severe end of the spectrum. But what does the picture look like for the wider population? So I was interested in tapping into that. Also, a lot of the research to date has involved examination of risk and predictive factors, so quite quantitative in nature. And this really means that there's a gap not only around young people's voices, but around the type of data. So that kind of rich qualitative accounts that can be really useful in really delving quite deeply into those kind of mechanisms that might be operating within the dynamic. So the PhD research for this reason involved solely young people, and that was young people aged between 14 and 18. And I spoke to young people both from youth justice, so some from that kind of higher end of need, but also those from a mainstream education context as well, to trying to tap into what violence and abuse towards parents in the general population might look like. And there was a real focus on young people's personal accounts of using violence and abuse towards parents. And I should probably say at this point that the majority, there weren't, violence and abuse towards parents, the young people in this study, a lot of it, the majority was towards biological parents and step parents. There weren't really any accounts where they discussed violence and abuse towards other type of carers. So it was limited to biological parents, step parents, and also in some cases grandparents. But this issue does affect, any form of carer. It could be an adoptive carer, so adoptive parent, a foster carer. You could be, an auntie or an uncle looking after your niece or nephew. So this form of violence and abuse can really involve any kind of caregiver, but specifically here it was mainly biological parents, step parents, and in some cases grandparents. So what were the methods? So it was a mixed methods design, and I used an initial kind of quantitative self-report survey, and then followed up with a smaller number of young people for in-depth interviews. So overall, the research involved 221 young people aged between 14 and 18. And it's important to say that actually 3/4 of those young people were actually female. And it's important to say that because not only does the research in the literature not really speak to young people, but where there is interaction with young people or reflection in young people, typically that's reflection on male adolescents, not on female adolescents. So it was definitely a very an untapped voice, essentially, in the literature. So this was across 2 research sites, a sixth form college, and that was young people aged 16 to 18, and then a youth offending service, which was where I had access to some of those younger adolescents. And there was kind of 2 phases to the research. The first was the self-report surveys, and that was asking how common is adolescent to parent abuse and what does it look like? What are some of those behaviours? And then the second phase were those depth interviews. So this was really trying to tease out how do young people experience adolescent to parent abuse and its impacts? What are their perspectives on the issue? And that's going to be the focus really of the session today. So young people described a range of harmful behaviours towards their parents. And this included those which were physical in nature. So we have Penelope here. This is obviously, these aren't these young people's real names. They got to choose their own pseudonyms. So this physical behaviour, Penelope describes an incident where she was violent to her mother. And she says, in the last straw, because I ran out of the house afterwards, I smashed her head against the wall. So there was a real range of sort of severity in terms of the physical violence that young people described, and it ranged from kind of pushing, shoving, all the way up to kind of cutting with glass, and in this case smashing her mum's head against the wall. So a real range, but some of it really quite severe. Also behaviours that were verbal in nature, We have Jodie here, who's 17, and she says, I was just screaming for hours, calling her names, telling her how disgusting she is, telling her how much she failed. And that's probably important for me to say a little bit of context here about Jodie. Obviously, all of these young people have their own histories and contexts for why they were using violence and abuse towards their parents. And that's not to justify it at all in any means, but these contexts are really important for how we're understanding what they're saying. So in terms of Jodie, she had been exposed to a lot of a sort of intimate partner abuse as a child, so between her mother and boyfriends and her father also. And she was also exposed to a lot of substance misuse in the home, and she had been taken into care. So she'd been in care for a lot of her life, and she had come out of care when at the point that I'd spoken to her, so when she was 17, she'd recently come out of care and she'd moved into sort of a range of hostels and then sort of semi-independent living, and she was sort of reuniting with her mother at this point. And this is her talking through essentially her meeting up with her mother and how she built all this up inside for so long. But this, unfortunately, there was also a lot of violence within these reunifications sort of meetups. So this was one of those. There are also emotional or sort of psychological forms of abuse going on. So Ruth, who's 18, says that, and this was reflecting on abusive behaviour that she had been using when she was 15 or 16. And she said towards her mother, I was like, I'll file reports on you because you hit me, even though she didn't. And I go to the levels of getting my friends to hit me to make bruises. And Ruth actually, tried to get social care to take her into care on a voluntary basis. And there was a lot of kind of manipulation around her behaviours. There was also a lot of economic or material abuse, and I would say sort of material abuse was the more common. So Jason here, who was 16, he said, so I was arguing with him, that's his mum and his nan, and then after that I went into my room and just ended up smashing my room up and just punched the wall and things like that. And Jason said that this is how he kind of tried to let off steam. And this kind of helped him to calm down. But obviously, that has implications, and not just implications in terms of the fact that it destroys things in the home and parents have to replace those things, but also that it's very threatening and intimidating, and it can be used as a kind of form of control or a kind of a form of punishment for not getting your own way or for feeling distressed. So what were some of the impacts of these behaviours? So young people again managed to describe a range of harmful impacts of their abusive behaviour, and this included physical injuries. We've got Joe here, one of the younger participants, describing a fight that she had with her mum. And she was smashing things, and essentially her mum got really hurt. So her mum got badly hurt. She had glass in her leg, and her mum actually phoned the police. So you've got physical injuries here as an impact on parents. But also you do have, from the perspective of Joe, this actually did lead to the parents being called and led to Joe being taken down to the local police station. So there was also a discussion around the fact that she found that not a very nice experience. And so there are these kind of legal implications and emotional implications of being taken into custody. And Joe was in the context of a youth offending service. So she had experienced sort of youth offending context quite a lot in her years. So property damage, that was quite a common impact, I would say. Pete, who's 15, described a time when he was upset, and he had a social worker, and the social worker, he went outside for a breather, and he said, because I went out just for a breather, but the social worker said, don't let him back in the house. So his parents didn't. So I started kicking through the door. And this actually ended up in the police being called again. So, and the police taking him into custody. And then after this, Pete actually was then sent to a secure home. So he had to live there. So at the time I was speaking to him, Pete was actually in care at that point with visitations to his family. Other consequences included financial Ruth here describing that her mum, nearly got fired loads of times because of me truanting and the school demanding that she came and got me from the police station and stuff like that. I nearly got her fired from her job, and then we'd have been, well, probably made homeless because she had no job and stuff. And I would say Ruth and some of the older sort of teenagers that I spoke to, they were much more able to reflect. I suppose because they were reflecting retrospectively, they had much more insight into the impacts that their abuse had, and were able to, fortunately for a number of them, look back, having now moved past that phase of their life. Importantly, emotional harm, that was a really important form of harm that young people spoke about. Ruth, again, I think at some points, I can't say this is a fact, but I remember her mentioning something. I don't know if it was just an off the cuff comment that I'd actually made her mum start to feel suicidal because she couldn't deal with the way I was being. So some really serious emotional implications there. And I think in a number of these cases, interviewees' mothers were parenting alone, or if they weren't parenting alone, it was still a highly gendered form of harm directed mainly towards them as primary caregivers, as those being most in the home. And yeah, for a number, they were actually parenting alone and parenting in the wake of domestic abuse as well. So they were dealing with multiple sort of distressing and sort of traumatic sort of background sort of things going on in the background and histories. So in terms of emotional harm, I suppose it's important to say as well that these emotional harm isn't just on parents. So although these things were emotionally harmful towards parents, the young people themselves were also damaged emotionally by this dynamic. And Penelope here describes how she felt like she wasn't good enough because of that violence. So she says, and I think obviously you're going to feel like, I felt like I wasn't good enough and I was not good enough for anyone because I was violent and stuff. So obviously I took the overdose. And there were actually two young people within the interviewees who had attempted to take their own lives because of this dynamic. And there were lots of other stressors and distressors going on in their lives at the time. But they did sort of pinpoint that their use of violence and abuse at home made them feel, you know, sort of depleted their self-esteem essentially. And that contributed towards those feelings of distress. And importantly, Jo here commented that the dynamic damaged their relationship with their mother. It's ruined my relationship between me and my mum. So that was some of the impacts that young people spoke about, and I think we can see that you can see it's really clear the negative and really quite damaging impacts that this form of abuse can have at home. And but young people's most kind of, I suppose, significant contribution within this piece of work was on their reflections on the causes, the contexts, and their motivations for using violence and abuse at home. So why they thought it happened, what were their framing, what was their framing of the issue? And so I thought before we would get going, before I tell you what they outlined as the causes and contexts, I thought we would move on to put it over to you. So what do you think when asked, what do you think are the causes and contexts and motivations for your violence and abuse? What do you think were the reasons that young people gave? Young people discussed a range of causes and contexts from which the violence and abuse towards parents arose. So it was really rich discussions. And these broadly can be sort of captured in this kind of social ecological model of child development. And I found that quite useful in organizing the concepts and organizing these kind of mechanisms and influences. So in this inner circle, we have those things that that were really sort of located in the child, in the young person. And these included things such as what they felt was maturity, them being mature or not being mature. And I'm obviously going to dive into these things in more depth in a minute, but this is just kind of an overview. A sense of entitlement. So someone brought that up in the chat. Emotion regulation or a lack of emotion regulation. A lack of coping resources to deal with to deal with a range of stressors, and these kind of stressors can be seen on this circle on the next circle here. We've got family stressors such as parent mental health, drug misuse, and loss, but also stressors around schooling and absent fathers. Other things we've got in here located within the child are trauma. So although these traumatic events happened within these wider circles, so that's within the kind of family circle, that trauma was really located within the child, and quite often felt like it was impacting their ability to regulate emotions, to communicate effectively with their mothers in the majority of cases. Substance misuse featured, but not very strongly, and that's kind of a bit in contrast to the wider literature, which picks out substance use as being quite key in a number of cases. And I think it is important to say that this is just one sample across two different locations of 21 young people. It's by no means a kind of wide and totally encompassing representation of young people and their experiences. So it's not going to capture absolutely everything. You've got here on some of these outer circles, parent coping resources, parent-child communication, issues around school, and also the gendered nature of parenthood. And we're going to discuss that a bit more as we go along. So there were 5 main intersecting themes in terms of the drivers for young people's violence and abuse towards their parents. These were, and this underpinned a lot of the others as well, young people's past and ongoing experiences of violence, abuse, and trauma. And I've just picked out one quote for each one of these before we go into it in more depth in a moment. So Jen here, who was 14 and she was a victim of peer violence, she said, "Because that's what's happened to me. People have been violent to me. That's how it's brought me up. All that's in my head now after what's happened, so the violence from a peer, is just violence. I can't stop myself from doing it. It just happens and I'm like, I want to stop, but my brain's gone." So that kind of really detaching herself from her using the violence towards her mother. And there was a real sense of the violence that she'd been victim to from peers in the community, really kick-started her use of violence at home, and that she said she'd been a model student up until this point. She'd been really nice at home. Obviously, we've only got her perspective on that, not her mother's. And it is important to think that this is just one part, one perspective. It's not multiple perspectives. But she said essentially that this was a real trigger for her deterioration in terms of her behaviour at home. The next theme was the dynamics of power, control, and agency in the parent-adolescent relationship. So by this, we mean this kind of negotiation, this everyday negotiations of power and control, of being able to do things, of being not allowed, of being boundaried by parents. And this being really kind of one of the main sites of where those abusive and violent incidents happen. So you've got the kind of those past and ongoing experiences of violence, abuse, and trauma that really underpinned a lot of the issues. But the actual power and that negotiation of power and control, that was kind of almost the momentary trigger for when there might be violence or abuse. That was what triggered the responses from young people. And Ruth here says, the first time she was violent, I think was because she took my phone off me. So I tried taking hers, because like, if you're going to take my phone, then I'm just going to take yours then. And Ruth went on to kind of have quite a long description of how her phone was like a comfort blanket. And I'm sure this will kind of probably resonate with a lot of you in terms of if you've done a lot of work with young people, that the phone is like their comfort blanket. It means access to friends. It's a really central part of their social world. And so taking it away, especially when she was experiencing other challenges, was really meaningful. And she felt like she wanted to. She said, to make the power dynamic more level. She said she wanted to make the hierarchy more level, essentially, by taking her mum's phone off her. And this led to quite a violent incident where they were struggling for phones. So the next theme intersecting theme was young people's experiences of stress and coping. So Penelope here gives an example of one particularly violent incident towards her mother. And she said that the lead up to this was when we had our mock exams going on. So it was really stressful at that time, had a lot going on with friends at that time. And me and my mum clashed over something and I got quite violent and I was like punching and kicking and I smashed her head against the wall. So Penelope was really useful in highlighting how some of these kind of wider stresses, but particularly between that kind of originated at school and from friends, how they really contributed to that overall kind of increasing volatility in her mind and then taking that out on her mum at home. The quality of communication with parents was seen as being really core. And it kind of, I suppose, mediated a lot of these other issues. So, for example, young people's trauma experiences, the victimization experiences, hampered their ability to communicate calmly with parents. And then the knock on for this was like an escalating model where parents would shout, they would shout, and then it would escalate into those more physical behaviors. And obviously, those behaviors that were really quite emotionally abusive and emotionally harmful as well. Ronnie, who's 17, says, when we get into an argument, that's her and her mum, she doesn't listen to me, and then I don't listen to her, and we end up clashing. So really tapping into there, that a kind of escalating model of communication. And communication was seen not just as, it wasn't all just about, being loud or not being loud, although that was sort of the volume of arguments was seen as quite a driver. There was also a sense of there being a lack of communication at home. So, particularly around where there'd been sort of victimization experiences, no one wanting to talk about it. So, no one wanting to talk about histories of domestic abuse, obviously, because that's painful and difficult to do. No one wanting to talk about the ongoing experiences of violence and abuse towards parents. One of the young people said, it's just not what we do. We just don't have that sort of talk at home. So there being a real lack of communication. So when it says quality, it's kind of where it was there, it was quite often loud, it was quite often harmful, and where it wasn't, that was also producing its own harm, because I think as one person put in the Padlet, that it meant that people don't feel like they're heard. And that was a really, really important theme here. And then the fifth theme, the fifth main driver from young people's perspective was that they had difficulties with anger and regulating their emotions and their responses to their emotions. So, creating that gap between feeling something and then acting on it. But in a lot of cases, young people who were using this, oh, it was because I was angry, it's because I couldn't control myself. This quite often was accompanied by a kind of narrative where they were saying, well, I couldn't help it. I lost it. I lost control. So you can't put it on me, sort of thing. And that is kind of some of the similar narratives that you do hear from intimate sort of perpetrators of intimate partner abuse, where they kind of distance themselves from being able to actually exert control over those abusive behaviors. That's not to say it's always the same thing, because as I said at the start, CAPVA can be due to a range of issues. A number of people highlighted neurodivergence as being an issue, and that really is. So there is a whole spectrum, some of which is more akin to sort of intimate partner abuse, and some of it which is actually, it feels like quite a different thing. Feels more expressive and more like expressive abuse, expressive kind of violence and expressive of distress. So here Penelope says, violence was because I was over the top angry. It's just that if I get angry and cross the line, I can like lose control of myself. And so, as I've said, a number of interviewees' accounts acted to redirect accountability and blame away from themselves and back towards parents. But it was important to say this wasn't all of the time. And that there was, to be honest, a handful who did it quite regularly, but it was in no way the whole sample. And there were kind of when young people did do this, there were kind of four main ways they did it. That was through denial, through justification, through minimization, and then through this fourth method, which is called claims of reduced competence, which is what we've previously seen. So that kind of, I lose control of myself. So I couldn't possibly be able to control myself. And we typically see this in the intimate partner abuse literature around substance use. So claims of reduced competence tends to be, oh, well, I was hammered. So, you can't hold me accountable because I didn't know what I was doing. And so it was kind of akin to that. So I've got one quote here, which is from Jen, and Jen was the most frequent user of these kind of methods for creating narratives that meant she was not blamed or she was not accountable for her actions. And she said here, do you know, if I've seen someone angry on the street, I'm not going to go up to them and make them more angry by taking their phone off them. Do you know what I mean? Or trying to take their drink, because then I'd probably just get hit, wouldn't I? So that real kind of justification of why she had been using violence towards her mother, justifying it because it was the way her mum was being that meant that she was doing this. So a real reframing there. And I think the reason it's kind of so important to highlight this is that this is where young people are a lot of the time. So Jen was younger, and I would say, some of these techniques were definitely used by those still currently at that point still using abusive behaviors. And I think it's important for us to engage with these, because if this is how young people are framing their violence and abuse, i.e. it's not their fault, that needs to be addressed first before any meaningful change can happen. Because if they're not in a position where they think, actually, I have control over this is, a large part of this is me and my responses to my feelings. If they don't feel that it's in their gift to make those changes, then that change isn't necessarily going to happen. So this was kind of why I did a kind of additional piece of analysis here around these kind of narrative techniques. And I don't have them in here, but I happen to have my PhD next to me, so I just wanted to read out a couple of other ones. So in terms of denial, we had Jen again say, and I don't want to hit her, but if ever I went to hit her, if ever I did go to hit her, it wouldn't be me. I can tell you now it wouldn't be me. Not saying it's ghosts, but someone will just take over me. So a real kind of denial that those things were even happening, that they had even happened at all. And then in terms of minimization, there was a lot of, I just pushed her. All it was, I didn't, it wasn't domestic abuse, or it wasn't abuse. I just pushed her up against the wall. A lot of justs, a lot of minimization. And then, yeah, the claims of reduced competence were often around, it meant that I wasn't inhabiting my body at the time. And a lot of young people, he said, that they just blacked out, that they couldn't account for those incidents where they'd used quite severe violence, that they just blacked out. And when I asked them if that happened generally with other arguments with other people, they said that it didn't, only with their mothers. So obviously a real kind of, I don't know, a cognitive barrier there in terms of being able to recognize those behaviors as abusive. So a number of these contextual factors, they did intersect. So they weren't just standalone. These weren't just single explanations for violence and abuse at home. They happened in tandem. They kind of reinforced one another. So, for example, young people's histories of domestic abuse at home resulted in trauma and resentment in young people. And then that lack of communication, combined with the sort of difficulties with emotion regulation, meant that it was kind of the perfect storm, as it were. And I kind of created these, they're called causal loop diagrams, to kind of show where behaviors feed into one another. So violence and abuse and neglect of the young people that you have over here on the right, that really damaged that the quality of the parent-child bond. And that also was kind of contributed to by absent fathers. So resentment around absent fathers not being there, leading to resentment, leading to displaced violence towards mothers, that kind of blaming mothers for the absence of fathers. So these diagrams I found really helpful in kind of mapping out essentially the emotional terrain, but particularly around young people's victimization experiences. And if you want me to send you some of those, I've just got one here in this slide deck. But if you want to see some more of those, well, you can get in touch with me, or you can actually, there's a link to my PhD at the end of the slides. So a lot of you are social workers, so you understand that thinking systemically is really important. And this is because we can see what those intersections are. We can start to try and unpick what some of those driving features of harmful dynamics are. And if we can identify the drivers, and we can start to try and intervene to address those drivers. So improving that parent-child communication, importantly, addressing those victimization experiences. And we can see kind of how some of these, especially what I have a causal loop diagram around communication, we can start to see some of these escalating models of, the volume of arguments, forcing young people to speak when they're already kind of in the red zone, as it were, and how appreciating these models can help us to sort of de-escalate and avoid those escalation cycles. So, violence, abuse, and trauma. I would say there was 5 intersecting themes of violence and abuse and trauma really underpinned a lot of it. And that's not to say that in all cases of child to parent abuse, there is violence and abuse and trauma, because there were, some young people that I spoke to where that hadn't been a feature. But it was really quite significant and notable for the majority. So for most interviewees, that meant that he had experienced either domestic abuse between parents, they'd experienced direct child maltreatment, or they'd experienced violence from peers, and also kind of sexual violence from those outside of the home. And there was a real overlap. We know that about particularly women and girls' experiences of gender-based violence throughout the life course, that quite often these things don't just happen in isolation. So a number of these young people were kind of poly victims of multiple forms of victimization. And although they didn't always state that these were connected explicitly, it was clear that these victimization experiences has resulted in sort of harm and detriment to their emotional and cognitive development, their mental health and well-being, and importantly, their feelings of resentment, anger, and blame, which pretty much nearly always they actually took out on their mothers, even though in the majority of cases it wasn't their mothers who had caused that harm in the first place. It was quite often male caregivers, so fathers, mothers, boyfriends, things like that. So these impacts on their development made it very difficult for them to regulate their emotions in the face of those everyday stresses and strains and negotiation at home. So you can start to see here how you have the violence and abuse and the victimization underpinning the development and those personal capacities. And then if you don't have the communication and those regulatory capacities, that's going to make that negotiation of power and control very difficult. And in a number of cases, parents did not seem to know how to support the emotional needs of their children. But I would like to say that in a number of cases, mothers were also victims in their own right, where they were victims of this form of abuse, but also victims from intimate partner abuse. So they had a lot of unrecognized trauma in themselves. They were struggling to regulate their emotions, and there was a real lack of communication around these experiences, these kind of shared traumatic experiences. So it's important to say that this is in no way me trying to blame parents for this. It is difficult to know how to effectively support your children with their mental health needs. And this unfortunately resulted in young people using violence as a means of them coping with their trauma and communicating their distress to parents. So mothers were nearly always the targets of abuse and blamed for fathers not being there. So blamed for experiences of sort of experiencing domestic abuse as a child, but then also blamed when fathers were then kicked out of the home for that domestic abuse. So and this meant that mothers were parenting alone. The violence and abuse was more towards mothers because they were parenting alone, because young people were closer to their mothers emotionally, as well as in proximity terms, but also because they feared their fathers and they knew that their mothers wouldn't leave them. And I have a couple of quotes here from Jodie. When I suggested, would she ever be violent and aggressive to her father, she said, me being aggressive towards my dad? Are you crazy? And actually, when we got into it, she said that her dad was really quite violent. He was a gangster in the local community and had actually kidnapped her and held her within his home for some months, not allowing her to leave until she managed to jump over the basically scale down the outside of one or two stories to get out of his flat, to then run away. So she really did have quite a traumatic history. But yeah, this was her response to me asking if she would ever be violent towards her father. So you can see it's really highly gendered. And then Ruth said, in terms of why she was violent to her mother and not my father. So I thought that if I was horrible to dad, he'd leave for good and he'd never come back. Whereas in a really selfish way, I knew mum would stay no matter what would happen. So we can sort of start to see there that the close proximity, but also that emotional closeness. Um, and then conversely, the fear of losing the emotional closeness with fathers means that mothers really are the main targets of this form of abuse. And it isn't to say that there aren't cases where it's fathers and stepfathers, because that does happen as well. But I would say that the predominant targets are mothers. And this is because of the gender. So these causes and contexts um, kind of highlighted a number of motivations, functions, and intentions for the violent and abusive behaviour. Now, there's a lot of sort of back and forth around the issue of intentionality in child-to-parent abuse. So, do young people intend their violence and abuse? And I think that it can potentially be more useful to think of intentions rather than it being like I'm intending on being really mean or harmful, it being more like they have functions. So violence and abuse is having a function for young people, and that is in no way sort of justifying it, but I think it's maybe a more approachable way of saying that sometimes young people are using these behaviors and it is intentional, but it isn't necessarily intentional to be harmful or abusive, but the intention is to achieve something. And some of these intentions here included letting off steam. So young people feeling that it was really building up inside them, and particularly, with young people who are neurodivergent, this can often be the case, when they're at school all day, they're masking, doing a lot of masking, and that's taking up a lot of emotional energy. And then they get home and they really need to let off steam. But unfortunately, in this case, this was resulting in a harmful dynamic towards parents. So Jason, who was 16, said, at the time, obviously I was angry and upset. But when I'd smashed everything up, I just had that relief. It just calmed me down. Another intention was self-defense and retaliation in response to violence and abuse from parents. So in some cases, particularly in relation to male caregivers, but also in terms of towards some mothers, the intention was self-defense. And we've got here by Pete, who was the young man who was taken into care and taken away by police. He said about his stepdad, like, he'll push me and then I'll punch him. So his violence, not all the time, but in some cases, was a direct response to violence from his stepdad. And you could kind of say, I wouldn't call it mutual sort of abuse, because I think in this case, his stepfather, he had that power over Pete, who was only 15 years. So I think that even in some cases where Pete might have been violent first, that you could see this almost as preemptive violence in a context of victimization from his stepfather. And I think this is often one of the challenges of child to parent abuse, is that it isn't one thing. It's not one thing across different families, but also even within a dynamic between one sort of parent and child that can change over time. In one moment, it could be very expressive, so with no real intention behind it. And in the next moment, it could be more manipulative. And it's important to recognize that it's quite fluid and that can move backwards and forwards. So other intentions included a means of punishing mothers for past harms, and I've kind of discussed this quite a bit already, but there was a real sense of mothers being responsible for the victimization experiences that young people had and the lack of fathers being at home. But a number of the young women who were discussing this did recognise that actually their mothers weren't to blame, but that at the time they just didn't feel that way. So you've got here Ruth, who was a victim of sexual assault by her mother's boyfriend. She said, I isolated myself, but convinced myself that mum isolated me, which caused a lot of problems because obviously I blame her for everything, even though it wasn't her fault. And actually, the interview with Ruth was really quite powerful for Ruth in that, we discussed the impact of her behaviours on her mum, whether she felt her mum was scared of her, and she recognised that she probably was. And she did find the interview upsetting, but she did say also at the end that she had found it really helpful because she'd never really been asked those questions before, and it had helped her to reconcile some of the experiences that she had. And so we can really see here how it might be very difficult sometimes to involve young people in research, but it does have real benefits, not just to the person researching. Obviously it benefited me. I was the researcher, I was trying to get my PhD research done, but for a lot of the young people it enabled them to tell their story of their experiences, and it acted as an opportunity for them to process their emotions around quite a complex family dynamic and a family history. So another intention included a way of communicating stress and crying out for help. So Ruth again says, they don't really understand mental health too well, and the only way I could make them understand was just by acting up. I was crying out for help, but I was doing it in ways that actually were just making people not want to help me. So we can see here again this escalating model where struggling to communicate, using violence and abuse almost as a method of communicating, but then actually that doing the reverse of what you're trying to achieve, which is to get that support and to feel heard. And the last intention was as a way of gaining power and control over young people's privileges, space and movement in and outside of the home. And I think someone did indicate this on the Padlet, around kind of expectations and around what you can have at home. So essentially, young people felt like they had the rights to certain things, space and movement being one of them. So they had the right to go out and see their friends. They had the right to be on the computer, be on their mobile phones, and they didn't necessarily want to contribute towards the house. So there was a real sense of I've got the right to have these privileges, but also I shouldn't be contributing to the household. So that was really inherent in that kind of negotiation of power and control that I talked about. And Jo here says, in terms of discussing her triggers, she says, well, like if her mother says, oh, that doesn't go with that, or I don't like them shoes, or you're not getting this, you're not getting that. So a number of young people talking about, how refusal of their requests really kind of acted as a trigger, and essentially their violence and abuse was a way of achieving and getting the things that they wanted. So obviously a real mix of intentions and functions there of the violence and abuse towards, well, mothers mainly. And I think these kind of accounts further the debate really on whether child to parent abuse represents reactive or instrumental forms of aggression. So instrumental being that kind of intentional aggression where you're trying to get something out of it. Reactive being you're responding in the moment. There's no real intention. I think that it kind of highlights really that it can be both things. And it's not just one for one person, one for another. It can be both. It can be one in one moment. It can be another in another moment, or it can start off potentially as reactive aggression and can develop over time into a kind of controlling dynamic, because the dynamic does change over time as well. But the root causes of young people's violence did seem to lie in their histories of abuse and trauma, which meant that they were angry and resentful. They were struggling to regulate their emotions in the face of everyday stresses and strains. But importantly, they were often being parented by mothers who were dealing with their own trauma around the abuse. So in terms of what young people thought might help address the parent abuse dynamic. So these things really they kind of tapped into what they thought the causes were, and that was nice because it was a nice kind of overlay in terms of a sort of nice lead on. Essentially, they identified what the causes were, and then the things that they thought would help were kind of directly addressing those things. So they kind of broadly they were into three buckets: things that parents could do, things that young people could do, things that services could do. And unsurprisingly, the majority of them were around what parents could do, with reflection how they could change being less of a focus. And obviously that's why it is important for us to be speaking to parents as well as young people, because that's, you're going to get that sort of skewed framing. So what were these things? Talking, listening, and not shouting. So really wanting to have improved communication in the home, to have talk that wasn't really loud, because that kind of escalated conflict at home, and to have a bit more of a listening culture, a bit more of a communication culture at home. The ability to spend quality time together. Now, it is classic in this dynamic that it erodes the ability of parents and children to have, to have nice times together, to relax. And that then in turn is detrimental to that bond, because you don't have those nice shared activities. So spending quality time together. But young people being given the space to grow, and also the space to calm down when angry. So a number of the young people felt that the way that they were parented was overly strict, and it wasn't necessarily age appropriate. So they felt like they wanted to have, to be treated with more respect as someone who was going into um, a later adolescence, so space to grow, and the space to calm down when angry. So we kind of, a lot of you will be familiar with that, the sense of coming back to arguments cold, and a lot of the parent abuse, the child to parent abuse interventions operate on that kind of model, not trying to um, address conflict in the moment when everyone's really agitated, going your separate ways, coming back to it cold. And that was really reinforced by young people's accounts. Importantly, a number of young people felt that they really wanted a confidant to hear their side of the story, and to guide them through conflict with parents. And they said that this wasn't someone in a kind of a sort of teacher at a teacher level. It needed to be someone more on their level. So potentially some sort of key worker model, and I suppose good youth work, really. So someone that can have fairly informal conversations with young people, can hear their side of the story. Someone said they had a school therapist, but that didn't necessarily work. So potentially outside of that schooling framework. Um, and then importantly, that leads me on to therapeutic support to heal past trauma. So a number of the young people spoke about having family therapy and also individual therapy. The individual therapy helped them to address their own experiences of trauma. And then the family therapy helped to bring them and their mothers, in these cases, together to have, um, to have sessions where they could both hear one another in a more controlled and safe space. And then in terms of what young people could do, they said not acting in anger, so thinking first. So trying to create that space between feelings and then reactions. And a number of young people indicated they felt that as they had grown older, that they had managed to develop this capacity. But obviously we can sort of appreciate that those who are neurodivergent would struggle with this capacity, and it does form quite an important and common component of a lot of child to parent abuse interventions, this helping young people to identify their emotions and to respond to them and manage them in more healthy ways. So a lot of these insights really did reflect what we know is positive work in this space. So we have Penelope and Ruth here, who were, if I'm honest, the I suppose the most insightful young people that I spoke to, in terms of being able to reflect back, and particularly in terms of, because they were reflecting back on a period of time which they had moved through successfully, and they were able to think about what might have worked or what did work in helping them move through it. So Penelope talks about, it really was such a communication barrier that was between us. And I think if we just learnt to let that barrier down, let that wall down, and just sit down and talk more about everything, then it would just stop everything arising. And then Ruth said that she had had therapy, and that it helped them to, like, the family therapy, and it had helped them to build up a relationship again by going out and doing stuff together. So we'd go out for like a lunch and stuff, or even just go out for a walk or a bike ride, or we'd watch a film together, get some chocolate, watch a film, and it felt like actually that really helped. So spending that time, taking that time to do nice things and regenerate that parent-child bond. But she said that none of that happened until she had actually spoken to a therapist. So she spoke to an individual therapist first about her experiences of sexual abuse, and then she had that family therapy with her mother. And she said, because I know for a fact I couldn't speak to mum, but speaking to a therapist helped. I didn't trust anyone at all, and I felt like I could tell her stuff. And she was saying her therapist was really responsive. They often met in quite informal locations, and she had a lot of access to her. And she said that that helped to make her feel, I suppose, more adult, and that in turn helped her to feel like she could take more responsibility of the issue that was going on. So some of the key implications for policy, practice, and future research here were that given the number of young people with trauma and mental health difficulties, that support for families does need to be trauma informed, so sensitive to those traumatic experiences and working in a trauma informed way. A lot of services now do that, so that's really positive, and that it really needs to be support focused. There was a time when there were more punitive measures in place, but particularly within a youth offending context. But even that now has moved to a much more support focused arena. So that is really positive development. But it just also highlight that multiple agencies need to be involved, just because, there were issues across multiple contexts. So education, social care, CAMS, and there was a lot of support that was needed, specialist domestic abuse organisations, because obviously mothers need to be supported too. Also, any support needs to be sensitive to the role that gender can play in shaping the dynamics. So being really appreciative that this is a really sort of gender shaped and gender based form of abuse. And that given the dual victimizer roles that mothers and young people here had, support and assessment needs to focus on both those perspectives, and both needs, the needs of young people and the needs of parents, because they are inextricably linked. They can't be disentangled. And where we are providing support, it should be focused on communication, supporting young people to manage their emotions, process their past trauma, and to rebuild their relationships. And kind of thinking about it systemically is a useful way. And I think probably most of you work in that way anyway. So I'm probably trying to teach you to suck eggs here. I appreciate that. So those were young people's insights into their violence and abuse towards parents. So we will talk, I think, a bit later about, what your overall thoughts were. But I just wanted to get a sense, firstly, how common is this issue in your work? And do you feel that you have the tools to address it? I know I'm thinking that it is potentially quite common, considering you all have a lot of thoughts about what the causes and context are. So yeah, if you could go to the next Padlet using that QR code, I'll put this in the chat as well. If you could talk a little bit about, is it something you see regularly? Is it not? And if you do see it, do you feel like you've got the tools to address it? And feel free, if you do have some good tools, it could be interventions or it might be approaches, feel free to pop those in as well. That would be really fantastic. I've talked to you a lot today about what young people said. I tried to make their voices as clear as I could in terms of what they thought was behind the dynamic, what their experiences were, what their feelings were. So I'm just interested, I suppose, to know, what are your key takeaways from the session today? Was there anything that surprised you? Is there anything you thought would be there that wasn't? Um, has it kind of given you any ideas to take forwards moving on? So yeah, what are the key takeaways? What might you go away and think about further or implement when you go away? And if you want, what could I take away from it? Is there anything that you'd as me as a researcher you'd like me to take away and to develop further. That would be really useful for me to know as well.